Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Elements of Sustainability series. This week, you will gain access to fundamentals of sustainability directly from university professors, unfiltered, untamed, just like if you were in a classroom. All of us make decisions every day that impact sustainable development. And that is why we bring to you the elements to empower you to become an intentional agent of change. It is with great pleasure that I start the series with Professor Sarah Soderstrom. Dr. Soderstrom is an assistant professor of organizational studies and program in the environment at the University of Michigan. She studies how individuals within organizations mobilize others, develop coalitions, and access key decision makers when they are trying to implement sustainability initiatives. In addition, she studies individual and organizational responses to the ambiguity and uncertainty that surrounds sustainability, such as making sense of emergent issues, prioritizing, agenda setting, and balancing multiple goals. With that, the floor is yours, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. I am excited to be here today and look forward to talking a bit about the history of sustainability and business transformation. And I hope what you take away from this talk is an understanding of how business, environment, and society are aligned, where they might conflict, and the history of the interactions across these different groups over time. I wanted to take a minute to thank Dow for hosting this and putting together this phenomenal group of sessions looking at all of these different components about sustainability. And I wanted to start a bit definitionally. So thinking about this lens of what is sustainability. And I find often if you ask 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. And one of the strengths of sustainability is our opportunity to really enact these lenses of what sustainability means for us as individuals, how it fits within our organizations, and how we can see business transforming society through connections with sustainability. When I talk about sustainability, I'll often come back to this lens of focusing on the environment, finances, and society. What we often talk about from the lens of the triple bottom line. And we like to look at this as a Venn diagram of considering different components that are not just thinking about finances, but also thinking about where there are connections with environmental impacts and societal impacts. But before talking about how they might fit together into a Venn diagram, I wanted to just step through each of these components individually. And so when we start, the idea of the triple bottom line emerged from what was originally a focus on one bottom line, economics, right? When we think about business, we think about profits, and we have this lens of what is the flow of money and a general expectation that any business that is there is not gone bankrupt because of the fact that there is profit, right? When we think about the economic bottom line, financial bottom line, we consider different variables that connect with the flow of money. Might be income, taxes, employment costs, right? Shareholder returns, long-term value, spend, utility costs, consumers, what they'll pay for, when they see this value that they'll exchange. And this has long been the expertise of business, right? How do we effectively make money and innovate to increase our profits and our long-term kind of value? When we think about the triple bottom line, what we add to this is two other components so that we get to our three. One lens here is thinking about the environment, where we want to consider measurements that bring us to the lens of natural resources and how the environment impacts business and how, as a business, we may impact the environment. It could incorporate ideas like air and water quality, energy consumption, waste, and land use. And when we think about goals from the lens of the environmental bottom line, we think about ideas like reducing waste, increasing our usage of renewable energy, preventing the use of toxic chemicals in our processes. As you think about your role in your business, I think it's helpful to consider what is the environmental impact that you might see. Where are these impacts? How might they negatively impact the environment? Where are there opportunities to positively impact the environment? But also, how is your business impacted by environmental resources? What are elements of natural resources that you need to successfully make your product or deliver your service? And where are those constraining your ability to move forward as a business? The third bottom line that we talk about that rounds out our triple bottom line approach is thinking about social dimensions. And this includes considering the communities in which you're situated, the regions where you work, and may have measurements of ideas like education levels, equity, access to social resources, health and well being, and broader approaches to social capital. I think it's also helpful to think about some of these societal impacts from an internal lens on how what we do as a company, whether it's our safety measures, job creation, our reputation and attraction of talent, impact our connections to society more broadly, but also thinking about how we impact those communities more indirectly through how we might engage with our products and how consumers might use those to make their lives better, how we might have philanthropic efforts, how our policy changes might impact the communities that we work at. And so we have these broad approaches to social dimensions of our business. And similar to the environmental lens, it gets helpful to take a step back and reflect on which ways you impact the society that you're situated in, the communities where you work, and which ways those communities impact you, where there might be constraints, and where there are really opportunities to better partner and understand these impacts to drive towards addressing societal challenges through our business operations. When we bring this together, we come back to a perspective of thinking about a triple bottom line, considering not just how much money we're making, but also what impact are we having on the environment and what impact are we having on society. The trick, though, when we think about the triple bottom line, often isn't in defining it, right? We could probably all relatively quickly go back and think about dimensions for our own businesses that connect to each of these three different levels. The challenge is really understanding how do we measure it and how do we make sense of where there may be tensions across these different dimensions of the triple bottom line. We want to operate, and we are happy when we're in a space that is this darker green part where all three of the circles overlap in the middle of this visual. Things that are good for economics, are good for the environment, and are good for society. We hope that as we continue to talk about these spaces of market transformation, you're able to uncover and consider spaces that are in this win-win-win zone. However, we also want you to recognize and be aware of times when there might be trade-offs. It might not necessarily be clear. Right? I do a lot of work in the food space. And one of the challenges that we often have is how do you define what is better if you consider local food versus organic food? Where do value propositions come in? And how does that influence the strategies that you make as an individual company, but also as your company connects with stakeholders across your footprint? And so we want to introduce these ideas of the triple bottom line so that you start recognizing that and build your strategies to address it and hopefully move towards that ideal space. I want to also situate this historically so that we have a lens. I think today we hear the word sustainability frequently. If you were to go back and look at the frequency of the term sustainability, and you looked 15 or 20 years ago, you would see very few companies talking about this word outside of maybe their own financial sustainability, right? But thinking about sustainability from a lens of a triple bottom line, we weren't seeing reporting on that from many companies. We weren't hearing about that generally in the business press. And now you see that everywhere. If you were to do a random sample of Fortune 500 companies, almost all of them will have issued a sustainability report within the past 1 to 2 years that are highlighting their work in this area. It has become expected that we at least communicate to our stakeholders about this and consider these different dimensions of the triple bottom line in our operations. But that's not always been the case, and I think it's helpful to recognize how we got to this point. When we think long term, the history of business and sustainability, and I'm sure for many of you who are more historians, long term of going back just 100 years might not seem as long term. But when we think about the space of the history of business and sustainability, we look to the start of the focus here in the early 1900s. And one of the key components that we saw globally was a focus on preservation, conservation, and restoration, almost exclusively focused on the environment. Right? So preservation was focusing on protecting the environment regardless of the economic value. Right? Conservation was looking at using the land, but protecting it for future generations. And restoration had a focus of cleaning up polluted or ruined spaces so that they can be used again. And there would be debates in this space about whether a particular land use should be preserved or conserved. But in general, there was a distinction between nature and the environment and human activity. This wasn't necessarily looked at as an interactive space, but one where the land was kind of distinct from a natural perspective, and all of our activities within business, within education, within government, were seen as distinctive spheres. And from that kind of lens, we saw things like the emergence of the the national park system within the US that was focusing on this preservation space, but again, not as much of an interactive or engaged space between business and the environment. Now, in the mid 1900s, we had a lot more attention starting to be brought towards business's role in impacting the environment. This was driven predominantly by disaster. And so, while we'd like to tell a story where business proactively started engaging in this space, what we see was a number of different environmental disasters and often pointing towards the role of business and people in causing those disasters. Right? This was international in scope. We would see things like a killer fog in London, the oil spills, Cleveland's river catching fire. And these disasters in general prompted a more contentious action. Right? So we saw people viewing the environment as something now that couldn't just be preserved, that had these potentially vast negative impacts that wasn't impacting only the environment, but was impacting human space within that environment. And so the conversation shifted from preserving forests because forests in and of themselves have a value as nature into cleaning our air because without clean air, it was impacting our own health. One of the key elements that started to transition this conversation was a seminal book that brought attention to business's impact on the environment. And this was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that came out in 1963. And the book was published to kind of focus on the effects on the environment of pesticide use. It took her 4 years to complete. She spent significant amount of time trying to look at how DDT entered the food chain and started to bring to attention this lens of potential checks and balances between how we moved through the industrial kind of changes that protected one space, right? Improving the use of our food, but having impacts in other spaces as we think about the risks of things like cancer or genetic damages. What was really interesting is that she was able to, through this book, gain attention broadly. Right? There was negative reaction initially from the chemical industry. This brought a number of scientists, And we saw a view at this point that was more of starting a contentious lens of business and the sustainability. Um, this brought in a lens of regulation and a public awareness of how there was vulnerability amongst our own health by things that might be going on within the environment. So, as we saw this kind of combination of a handful of environmental disasters and growing public awareness, we continue to see a drive now of activism and regulatory responses. And so, this is again this historical space that had a contentious lens of business wanting one thing, regulation wanting another, and broad activism trying to push for greater regulation. So the solution at this point was a lens of trying to say that business would act because regulation forced them to protect the environment. 1970 was the first Earth Day, so what we're commemorating this week with these sessions here was a lens of thinking about people standing up to voice a protection for the environment. And we've seen that kind of continue across a number of different areas. Right? If we look at this lens, it's pushing against pollution, pushing towards a solution, but again, a pretty contentious anti business frame to how this was being activated and pressure on regulatory groups to be the ones who had the power to enact these changes. And I think that that's a really important space as we think about the mid to late 1900s is the way we saw activists really pressuring for regulatory change. There was less engagement between business and activists themselves and more of a mechanism of viewing regulation as the intermediary. And we saw a number of different components come up within the US. We had the Environmental Protection Agency that started. We had a number of different regulatory passages that are still enacted today: the Water Pollution Control Act, Endangered Species Act, Superfund established for the remediation of contaminated spaces. But we also saw conversations at an international lens. The UN, in particular, was involved in bringing together groups from across the world and bringing attention to the space that environment isn't localized in just one spot. Environment often spreads globally. And so if we think back to the term of, think global, act local, right, the UN was in a space to act global. And so they brought together, commissioned the Brundtland Report in 1987, which is the first place that you see the language of sustainable development being used. Right? 1987, that's where they coined that term and defined the term of sustainable development as a way of living today in a way that supports future generations. From a business lens, that started to connect a perspective on short-term focus with a long-term focus on how we think about the sustainability of our businesses. The UN continued with many other issues, notably climate change in 1992, bringing out the Framework Convention around climate change that led into future conversations that many of us are aware of, like Kyoto and more recently Paris, as we consider multinational, international approaches to addressing these types of issues. But again, through this lens is predominantly a term and a focus on regulation. And so I want to kind of take a minute to think about what implications that has when we think about a role of regulation. And from a positive lens, from if we take the perspective of those activists who are pushing for regulations, we see an approach of a role of regulation that is meant to create pressure on companies to innovate. They hope to align the environmental bottom line with the economic bottom line by making the fine or the risk of not complying such that they will invest in the environment. So basically improving environmental quality by making it more costly to not do it through fines and regulations, and using regulation to move that forward. From an innovative perspective, they'd like to see regulation help to raise the likelihood that we'll have innovations that focus on environmental issues. And so often we know that business fundamentally focuses on innovation. Right? When we consider all of the innovations that have happened through business, it's amazing to step back and to consider. But if the environment and society aren't part of what people are thinking about when they're doing that research and development, when you're starting to consider what you might innovate around, what products are needed, then it's less likely that the product in and of itself will be addressing these environmental or social issues. So, part of the motivation for activists from this lens is to have regulation bring environmental and social issues to the attention of key decision makers, of those who are involved in innovation, entrepreneurs, and R&D, so that they are then more likely to make business innovations that also engage with this triple bottom line approach. And then lastly, the idea is this matching of supply and demand. And the hope is that through environmental regulation, there would be demand for environmental stewardship, that regulation would bring attention to the environment, that then businesses would have less of a financial cost to addressing environmental or social issues, and that the broad public, through their support of regulation, through their support of elected officials, would build greater demand for this type of stewardship. And so this looks at kind of an idealized state of regulation and how environmental regulation in the best case scenario could move forward in addressing these. And I think many activists would argue that this was their motivation in pushing towards a regulatory approach to addressing sustainability issues. However, if we step back, we can recognize many potential cons of regulation as well. Businesses often felt significant costs. Certain businesses may have been penalized more than others. For some sorts of regulations, if you were an established company, adding into investments that you've already made for capital would penalize you more than younger companies that were just starting off. At times, environmental regulations were designed in a way that met a minimum of environmental quality. So you couldn't have a certain amount of waste coming out from any particular factory. But that then motivated a race to the bottom, right? How do we fix to get to this minimum level of pollution, but not actually think about how we might innovate and be motivated to do further? And so because of all of these potential cons and a broader politicization of issues whenever it comes to a regulatory decision-making space, we've found recently that regulations around the environment have broadly stalled, particularly within the US. We've seen very few environmental regulations move forward. Those that have seem to be transitioning from one political party to another. So every election, environmental standards seem to be at risk of changing. And that leads an environment for businesses that is uncertain. You're at risk of significant investments that you can't find returns on. Yet businesses themselves being part of society, and as part of society, as employing people who are part of our broader societal fabric, concerned about society themselves. So while we've seen a lens of businesses lobbying against various environmental policies and seen a role that continues potentially a view of contention between regulation and business, or environment and society and business, what we've also seen is this space of disentangling regulation from environment and society, so that the only answer isn't just regulating, but really seeing business moving into a space where business is an actor for sustainability. Right? We don't need to view this only as a lens of business protecting themselves and fighting potential regulatory areas, but instead we see business embracing their role in society and trying to uncover mechanisms for addressing societal challenges through business. And in many ways, if business can help address a societal challenge, can help address an environmental challenge, then you've answer this societal problem with something that is scalable and profitable. And that gives us a more sustainable solution than if we're dependent on something like philanthropy or taxes. And so businesses' engagement in this space as an actor for sustainability, I would argue, actually puts us on a stronger path as a society towards a sustainable future. And so as we recognize this interdependence between business and society, we also recognize that we need to build understanding and we need to build a recognition of what is responsible behavior by business and other stakeholders. And we see a number of different ways in which this is happening. One is through direct partnerships. So, for example, 3M and the Nature Conservancy have had a number of different partnerships working to address challenges that 3M may have been seeing aligned with particular products, aligned with particular communities in which they're situated, and working together to bring in some of the best from a lens of environment and what are those challenges, some of the best from the lens of design and R&D in addressing these needs. This is just one of a number of different examples. I've been doing a research project the past few years with the Environmental Defense Fund. They have a program that they call the Climate Corps Fellows. Many of you may have actually been hosts for some of the Climate Corps Fellows, but it's a really fascinating partnership where you have a nonprofit activist for the environment in the Environmental Defense Fund that is working with hundreds of different businesses who are saying, we want to think about how to address our energy usage, address climate change, and become stronger, sustainable citizens within business. An Environmental Defense Fund helps find incredibly well-trained graduate students who are interested in careers in business and sustainability, matches them with businesses who are interested in moving forward in this space, and then importantly provides them with a network of skills and knowledge and support that helps them address these new challenges that the different businesses are facing. And this is a critical role of cooperation between activists and business in a space where 20, 30 years earlier, you would have only seen contention. And so I think these are really interesting signs of how business, not all, but many businesses are really embracing their role as an actor for sustainability. Other examples that we see from business activity is around certifications, what we would call industry self-regulation. So industry saying we're not confident or understanding of what the government may determine from a regulatory perspective, but we can work together to build up a set of expected behaviors, of ideal behaviors, certify those so that our customers know that we're meeting these certain expectations, share across our network some of our best practices so that we can move forward with these sustainable enterprises. And so you see even business to business partnerships and engagements, often with third parties or NGOs helping to facilitate that. We'll see this a number of times with certifications where there's someone who will be in charge of auditing the expected outcome of a certain process or ensuring that a product really is green if a company says it's green. But these are mechanisms that we see, again, for businesses working with stakeholders that historically they may not have worked with as they're trying to build out themselves as addressing these social and environmental issues on top of financial issues. And so these partnerships, not just internal partnerships, but broadly with NGOs, with communities, with other businesses, are helping to move business forward. And a lot of that we can see as part of what's motivated and mobilized business activity in this space. If we think about the emergence of corporate sustainability, there are a handful of key drivers that have influenced corporate behavior in this space. Earlier in the 1900s, we talked about this space around activism, but what we've also seen is a broader lens in public of interest in environmental issues. This pervades into employees at all of these different companies who want to work for companies that are committed to helping the world become a better place. And so we see not just people in the communities where businesses work, but employees themselves starting to advocate for more and more sustainable actions within the business. We have continued to see activism from different nonprofits. Yet instead of targeting regulations, we're seeing more and more shareholder activism, where shareholder resolutions are trying to force engagement on issues such as labor conditions and climate change. Some of these have passed, which then enshrines the focus on these issues within the company goals. Others, even if they don't pass, have now brought attention to what have historically been viewed as issues outside of the scope of business into these key business activities. We're seeing a growing peer pressure because of the fact that more and more companies are highlighting their own sustainability activities. You don't want to be the one company that doesn't issue a sustainability report. You don't want to be the only company that sustainability report only shows pictures and doesn't actually track metrics and show progress as to how you work towards that. And so we're seeing this peer pressure lens of feeling like everyone has to be talking about this, at least in some dimension. The benefit of this is that we have more and more companies talking about sustainability, thinking about sustainability, and innovating in this space. The risk is that it's often harder to discern who's doing that really well and where there might be a risk of greenwashing, which is a term that's been coined because of people claiming to be environmental or social, but not standing behind that. And so I think it's going to be interesting in the next 5 to 10 years to see how this peer pressure starts to push not just for communicating and highlighting some of these activities, but documenting and standing behind them to kind of validate and legitimize this work broadly within business. Many businesses are seeing competitive benefits of embracing sustainability. Customers, particularly for those of you who are in businesses that are direct to consumer, are requesting and asking and buying environmental products and services. And so we see more of a competitive advantage for engaging in this, for engaging in it authentically, and for being a first mover in this space. Much of these other mechanisms, these pressures bubbled up in part because of the uncertain regulatory environment, and particularly the impact of that uncertain regulatory environment for the many multinational companies that have global footprints. Companies themselves, as they operate not just in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but across the US, and not just in the US, but across the world, are facing different regulatory environments in their Michigan plant, as in their California plant, as in their Paris plant, right? And so as you think about that space, that uncertain regulatory environment is motivating companies to do more, to do better. And then as they have success in that space, they're able to share those best practices across their footprint and elevate their footprint broadly around environmental and social issues. Now, of course, this isn't everyone, and it's not everywhere, but these are the mechanisms that we're seeing push companies to being more engaged with sustainability, and for those who really embrace it, being more successful in this area. And so as we recognize why some of this has emerged, we do see more companies feeling like they have to address sustainability, seeing the benefits of addressing sustainability and connecting their sustainability strategies with not just their own employees and their employee motivation, but with their financial performance and their ability to do well and do good. The challenge remains how companies decide what to do to engage with sustainability. At some points, there are so many different strategies that we can address that have something to do with the environment or society. The challenge is not whether to do a sustainability strategy, but what sustainability strategy works for you. And that brings us back to a broader business transition to a sustainability focus in really trying to localize and translate these triple bottom line ideals to your own company in thinking about What are the key economic measures for your company? What are the critical environmental impacts? What are the biggest influences on society that you have? And how do you prioritize across those to build up a sustainability strategy? This is in contrast to one of the more historically prominent approaches to business, particularly public businesses, that come from a lens of Richard Friedman, who is from the Chicago School of Economics, received a Nobel Prize in 1976 around economics, and was generally viewed as one of the most influential economists in the 20th century. And he published in the New York Times an article arguing that really, and I love this quote in a way that I love it, but I hate it, right? But there is only one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. This quote in particular, although the whole article itself is, I think, illuminating, brings a prioritization not of a triple bottom line approach, but of a singular bottom line approach. And with the way that it's been interpreted, often brings in a lens only towards short term profitability, right? So this highlights and brings in a concern that a business isn't being responsible if they invest in the environment or if they invest in society, if there is any risk to profit. Now, even within this model, we can think about and consider ways where there are that unique overlap of being beneficial to profits. And these are spaces that should be the easy strategies to encompass and embrace as a company. Right? So if we think about our standard first equation we see in any economics class, right? Economics 101, profit equals revenues minus cost. If we're trying to increase our profits, that means we either need to increase our revenues or decrease our costs. And as we think about environmental and social issues, we can often see many strategies that can help us do this. We can start by thinking about what helps us increase revenues. Now that we see a broader public that's interested in environmentally and socially conscious products, we can increase revenues with new products that target that market, that bring new consumers in, increase our sales, and connect with our profits. This is an easy win-win that even Friedman would agree with, that aligns a commitment to environmental or social good by increasing our revenues by targeting those particular markets, those particular products. Alternatively, and what we see quite often with a focus on efficiency, we can think about how does addressing the environmental and social bottom line help us decrease costs? And this is where a lens, if we're using less of a particular natural resource, then we're spending less money and we're making more profit, and it's better for the environment. Right? So how are there ways that we can decrease general resource use in our operations? Can we use less water? Can we use less energy? Can we innovate in a way that substitutes out a more toxic chemical into one that is less toxic? I mean, all of these are mechanisms that can potentially decrease our costs and increase our profits. So as we think about the basics of business economics, focusing on something that is socially responsible does not in and of itself mean that we are not being fiscally responsible. Often the two go hand in hand, and there are many spaces for companies to engage in that area and prioritize these elements that help us address what Friedman might have argued, but also address what environmental and social activists and consumers would push. That gives us a lens when we think about economics and sustainability of often seeing spaces when sustainability and economic concerns are aligned. Right? This is that upper quadrant, green color. Anything that falls into this box, we should be able to do right away. We should be seeing that happen in businesses already. What we often see, however, is that businesses might be operating in a way that is in the red here. It's bad for profit, and it's bad for the environment and society. And the reason that that happens is because people might not recognize or understand some of the complexities of environmental or social impact, might not have an awareness of the broader market that is now changing towards socially conscious consumers and moving towards aligning that. So there's still a lot of opportunity to move from a space that is red into a space that is green and capture what sometimes people will call the low hanging fruit. I feel like low hanging fruit should be a little bit easier often than capturing some of these benefits for sustainability are. Often does require innovation. It requires space to work in this and trade offs as we navigate it. But there are often many strategies that you can find and build out where sustainability and economic concerns are aligned. Now, it's not all rose colored glasses, as my mom likes to say. It's not always all positive, and there are often challenges when sustainability and economic concerns might conflict. And businesses need to understand and recognize what those trade offs are, where there might be innovations that can minimize a potential trade off, where understanding and focusing on a short term versus a long term set of returns might influence and change what those trade offs really look like. And that's where it becomes more challenging within an organization to ensure that your organization is aligned around values and priorities, that is focusing on some of these innovative spaces and considering the impacts in both the positive and the negative way so that you build out strategies that are data-based, aligned with your values, and moving towards this green box of having sustainability and economic concerns aligned. Now, we talked through Friedman, who would argue that you should never do anything if it's not in this green box, right? That's the only time that we should be addressing social or environmental issues. But I think that the issue of shareholder value itself has contrasting perspectives. And we've seen that from when Friedman first talked about it to today. And so to start with a quote from decades ago, Quaker Oatmeal, just a few years after Friedman's essay came out, was talking about Friedman's profits are everything philosophy as a dreary and demeaning view of the role of business and business leaders in our society. And this part I love, right? Making a profit is no more the purpose of a corporation than getting enough to eat is the purpose of life. Getting enough to eat is a requirement of life. Life's purpose, one would hope, is somewhat broader and more challenging. Likewise with business and profit. No one would argue that business can operate without a profit. Key differentiator between business and nonprofits is that business needs to have a profit over time to survive. The challenge becomes into a lens of prioritizing profits above all else, and the difference between having a profit and potentially profit maximization at the abstract and risk of other elements. This also prioritizes profit in a short-term financial lens without recognizing some of the longer-term impacts and the impacts on a financial bottom line, such as having a negative impact on a community, employee turnover, reputation, that are harder to quantify but so often tightly aligned with ideals of environmental and social good. Now, this debate didn't end in the 70s. Right? Here is a second quote from Jack Walsh in just about 10 years ago now. Talks about shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. Shareholder value is the result, not a strategy. Your main constituents are your employees, your customers, and your products. Managers and investors should not set share price increases as their overarching goal. Short-term profits should be allied with an increase in the long-term value of a company. And we've seen this focus on long-term value continue to strengthen and emerge. Recently, with Unilever, their transition in executives made a strong statement on a focus on long-term value of the company, and that being their guidance for strategy rather than an exclusive focus on short-term quarterly returns and short-term quarterly projections, right? So bringing this approach to a long-term value, incorporating not just a result of shareholder value, but expanding that to broader stakeholders that connect with your business and that help you move towards this long-term sustainability that incorporates financial health, environmental health, and social health. One of the more recent approaches that I've read that I appreciate with this is an article that McKinsey Quarterly put out a few years ago, where they called it Redefining Capitalism. And I find that just in and of itself a fascinating concept, right? What is capitalism and how do we define it? And if capitalism is defined purely as the allocation of funds from a business to its shareholders, then, as this article would argue, we're missing a broad opportunity of what capitalism is. And so they argue the essential role of capitalism is not allocation, it is creation. And what I really appreciate about their focus is this lens of how business has been a critical actor in making life better for people today than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Not because we're allocating funds to shareholders, but because we are allocating the resources of the economy more efficiently. We have life-saving antibiotics, indoor plumbing, motorized transport, access to vast amounts of information, enormous number of technical and social innovations that have become available. Now, this situates business in a really fascinating space, right? Because now you're looking for the financial incentive to create products and services that solve human problems and make that widely available. And this is where business, I think, can play a really critical role in our broader society. Government, in we could argue, but in many ways, does a solid job of allocating funds to operating where maybe there isn't currently a profitable solution, right? Roads, tax, etc. Nonprofits help address a number of key issues, but are dependent often on philanthropy, grants, and aren't able to build out solutions that are scalable because the solution themselves is profitable. And as McKinsey here stated, the genius of capitalism, the genius of business, is that when business innovates and finds out a solution, finds a product that helps solve this critical societal issue, these key human problems, then that solution makes a profit, and it's that profitability that makes the solution sustainable. We can keep making that year after year after year. We can work to figure out how do we make this available and accessible to more people and help address more of these problems by scaling these products and these solutions in a way that maintains the capture of profitability but continues to address these social issues. And when you think about the way your business is situated from a triple bottom line perspective, how do you build that economic solution that addresses these social and environmental issues? Then we're in the sweet spot of the role of business in society, right? The role of business in society aiding prosperity through solving human problems. I think that's an amazing space to be thinking about the power and the space for action that we all take through business. And I love the flip that this puts into how we think about business, right? It's changing the mental model of business as adversarial, as misaligned, as insufficient, costly, or a constraint to addressing environmental and social issues. It broadens business space outside of just philanthropy and charity into long-term solutions that move our society forward. It recreates our view of business as innovative, profitable, opportunistic, and building a competitive advantage by addressing societal and environmental issues and maintaining our financial health. And it always amazes me at how often we still see this disconnect in a view of business, society, and environment as potentially adversarial. And I would be the first to agree that there are companies that have not necessarily embraced a more holistic, sustainable view in their role of society. But I also find it hopeful to see where business can act and can move forward in these ways. And I am excited by the roles that all of you take within your companies in making those recommendations, building out those strategies, implementing these ideas that move business into the solution for these different societal challenges. Um, Much of my work has focused on the roles of individuals in really trying to mobilize others and encourage the companies that they're situated in to even be potentially more aggressive in addressing social and environmental issues within the companies that they operate. And I recognize through that work that often people might feel overwhelmed, might struggle, might get burnt out. And I hope that if you're in one of those spaces, you're able to find others who are on a similar path, that you can help to build each other's resilience, to continue to mobilize and act for our broader society through your roles in business. And if you're inspired right now and excited and doing great things, I hope that you connect with others who can learn from what it is that you're doing as we move forward in this space. Thinking about the key considerations for your business as you build out a roadmap for business and sustainability. And there are a handful of different dimensions about this. One is a lens of just enterprise integration. So, how do you think about what your business is doing today that you can do better? Where can you be more efficient? Where can you engage differently in your operations and your procedures? But also to push into this lens of addressing societal issues through business. Where can we transform the market? Were there new ideas and practices that can move us towards systemic sustainability and really define and underpin business as a force for good in the world? I know that in one of the later sessions, Professor Andy Hoffman from here at Michigan is going to be diving more deeply into this idea of market transformation. I think it's an inspiring area to think about yourself as business leaders in this transformation. As we wrap up, I wanted to reflect, if you haven't had a chance to look at Larry Fink's 2018 letter to CEOs. Larry Fink is the executive for BlackRock. It's a really inspiring memo that he sent out. And I wanted to quote some of his ideas here as you take a large scale company that is broadly influencing a number of others in the space and how he is viewing this role of business in society. Society increasingly, and I quote, is turning to the private sector and asking that companies respond to broader societal challenges. Indeed, the public expectations of your company have never been greater. Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution for society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Without a sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential. End quote. And so as you reflect this week, as we celebrate Earth Week, and consider your own roadmap for business and sustainability, I hope you take a few moments to think about your own sense of purpose, your company's sense of purpose, and how you can incorporate and consider these different components of a triple bottom line to really help mobilize and lead your company to achieving its own full potential. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciated having the chance to talk and wanted to have a chance to capture some of the questions that I know Erica has been thinking about.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for such a great talk. I love being in a time in history where business is not seen as a barrier, but as an enabler and an amplifier for sustainable development. And with that in mind, if there are so many actions where the triple bottom line is positive and good for the environment, for society, and for profits, why isn't that all businesses are already doing this? Why aren't all of us already there?
I think it's a frequent challenge, right? We know that these opportunities are here, yet it's so difficult at times to capture them. And I think that's also why it's so important that we talk about not just market transformation, but also enterprise integration. What are the things that we can do in today's business practices to improve our impact on sustainability? But if we think about why businesses aren't already doing this, I think we can all probably situate ourselves into different times when we recognize that we are focused on a lot of different issues, that businesses are very large and different people in different parts of the business are thinking about, have different goals, have different considerations. And it puts us in a situation where we all have limited attention resources. I can only do so much at any one time. And we end up doing what we call satisficing. We find a solution that best helps us address what we're doing and then stop, right? So we search through different ideas about how we might improve our processes to be more efficient. And we find an acceptable solution and then we stop because we have to keep moving forward rather than being in a situation where we can analyze all potential alternatives. And so there's this time constraint that often limits our ability to move forward or move forward in the most innovative way in capturing all of the win win that's out there. There are also structural components. Often we see limited integration of sustainability concerns into business operations. Sustainability issues are not necessarily easy, they're not always transparent, and it's not often what people are trained on or rewarded about. And so, if you have a space where you have sustainability group in one part of the organization and manufacturing in another part of the organization, as manufacturing is working on redesigning their processes, if there's not someone from the sustainability lens working with them, they might not even recognize or understand the opportunity to minimize the environmental impact or improve the environmental impact through the work that we're doing. And so that lack of expertise situated broadly across companies can constrain their ability to move forward. There are often operational norms and practices. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? So if we're operating fine, our customers are happy, we're making a profit, the fact that we can change something in that development process that might decrease our environmental impact, might save us some money, is viewed as a change that's seen as a risk. And so we need to overcome that risk aversion and adopt more of a lens of embracing and engaging with that. And that's where really an approach of integrating sustainability concerns broadly across the company and aligning organizational rewards with sustainability goals can help move that forward. And so I think those are two key components of integrating sustainability ideas and expertise across the company and aligning rewards around meeting environmental and social goals, not just profit, can help drive businesses to achieve more of those win-wins.
I really enjoy when you talked about the history of environmentalism and our perspectives, how every actor has evolved through this history, right? So we have industrialization, the population booming, then we have this very antagonistic role playing between companies and activists to the new sustainability movement where we are looking for collaborations and partnerships. Could you close this session by advising of what are the key items or the key perspectives that businesses and NGOs and governments need to take to create effective partnerships?
Partnerships can be tricky in the best of times, right? And so I think it's always important to take stock of what are your partnerships and why do you have them. I think one of the key elements of building a partnership is really recognizing this match between what are the needs and what are the skills of the different parties. And so you want to make sure that the needs that you're trying to address align with the skills that you have in the company or in the business. I did one case study on the Detroit Lions, and they recognized they were trying to build out a broader engagement with the city of Detroit. And they recognized there were a number of different needs in the city, but when they thought about what their skills were as a professional football team, they had skills around health and wellness that was uniquely situated for them, and that they could match that skills with the needs of the community. So, what are the needs for your potential partners? What are your needs? And how do you match skills across that? And then, how do you think about building out your partnerships that support both sides? Talk a lot about how you can consider yourself as a business in enabling your partners. So, how do you recognize their own goals and enable them to meet those and succeed? How do you engage with authenticity? And I think this becomes critical in sustainability today when too often there's a concern about something like greenwashing, that you're looking to stamp something green on a product, say you've checked the environment box and move forward. When you're looking for partnerships to really deepen your sustainability commitments, how do you recognize and engage authentically with your own goals for that and build trust through that space? This helps you understand where there might be mutual benefits for both parties in recognizing their goals and helping each other be stronger through the partnership. And that also helps recognize that this is a broader network, often, than just any solo partnership. So, how do you broker and support and connect others as you each work to meet these different goals? I think for business in particular, as it's moving its role into working with communities and other people, where we see often uh, distinctions in socioeconomic status, in power and privilege, but engaging with respect and humility with our partners, particularly as we think about different community partners that are often smaller, less financially solvent, and potentially more dependent on the partnership. This respect and humility builds the reciprocity that helps these partnerships move forward in success. And I think these sustainable partnerships in business in this role for societal good helps to position business in a space where it is connecting people and groups of people who might not otherwise have been connected, right? We're in a time where there is a lot of contention, a lot of frustration, particularly in the political environment. Yet business is bringing people together across the political spectrum, across the global spectrum, and has a really powerful space in their partnerships and in moving forward, in helping to be a connector. And I think that the partnerships that business makes with others are a key component to making those connections strong and helping to address the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Sarah. All of us play a role in creating a sustainable world. So continue to tune in into the lecture series. Until the next one.